Good morning. My name is Rachel Friedman, and I'm with the University of Oxford. I think I might be the only one not with no connection to the CG system, but that's not a problem. So I will be presenting on some insights from research carried out in in the high forest zone of West Africa in the central region of Ghana. I'm not going to go too much into detail on sort of background, but happy to answer questions later on that. But just to say, this project is embedded within a larger project within the Environmental Change Institute at the university. So this region is particularly of interest in terms of climate change, although it's very sort of uncertain as to what the actual impacts will be. The primary agricultural product is cocoa, which has a pretty limited range of climatic tolerances for growing. So eyes are turned there for what might future climate mean for that region. Within this research project, I'm focusing on women in the cocoa farming system, and particularly want to argue for a more nuanced examination of and subsequent action within this group, as we heard earlier in the plenary session. And for this particularly short presentation, although very sort of a bit more complex, I'll be sort of showing some preliminary data comparing women who operate or own their own cocoa farm and those who work on a piece of land associated with a husband's cocoa farm. So not necessarily cocoa itself. I'm particularly looking at indicators or points of vulnerability and what that might mean for adaptation to climate change. So one point of vulnerability is the sources of income and access to financial resources, particularly as it influences the ability to adapt in the future. So as you can sort of see, both groups of women have a pretty diverse set of income sources, although cocoa and food crops obviously sort of dwarf the others. And income diversification is definitely important generally due to the variability of the climate and the need to be able to sort of change as need be. But there are some interesting differences between the two groups of women. For one, those who have their own cocoa farms or operate their own cocoa farms get much more into service industry and also have access to resources that allow for them to diversify into oil palm, as well as, of course, they have access to cocoa. In terms of those who operate on their husband's land, they're more often expressed involvement in trading activities, such as going to market and buying from other people and selling, as well as voiced an interest or a difficulty in accessing funds in order to develop their own business. So there's really a drive to have a really solid source of income, but sort of a recognized gap in getting to that point. Finally, on that point, those who were on a husband's land more often were ones who expressed interest in sort of support groups or local women's groups that could potentially provide sort of a stopgap in funding or during hardship help support that, although there were no groups in any of the communities that I was working in. The second point of vulnerability is information, which we've already heard a fair bit about, but was also recognized as an important factor in these communities. Just in interviews versus, I don't have this on the screen, but in interviews versus comparing men versus women, corroborating sort of other statements, there is a decided lack of access to formal extension services among women and greater, access among the men. However, even within groups of women, there are differences. So those who work on a husband's land much more often cited radio programs, which included things like the Ministry of Agriculture's programs as well as weather services, whereas those who actually operated their own cocoa farm noted that they were more often likely to note that they did access extension services, although that's still a pretty small number who were able to do that. I'm not quite sure the implication, but women who worked on their husband's land often relied on their husband for information, whereas those who were operating their own land cited their parents or elders as sources of information, and perhaps that's just based on the inheritance structure. Finally, just to be conscious of time, there's the sort of social points of vulnerability, and for this I'll focus just briefly on empowerment, which is sort of a little bit intangible, but through conducting interviews, it was pretty clear that women who had their own access to or sort of control over their own cocoa expressed more direct ability to influence their future and that of their children, that they were directly contributing to the education and furthering of their children's careers. I don't know if I was just speaking to a lot of feminists, but the hardworking woman came up a lot among this group of women I spoke to. In terms of those working on a husband's land, there was a bit more sort of sense of powerlessness, and the notion that I can't do anything came up quite often in terms of being able to change management or sort of respond to variability that's already inherent in the system. For me, this raises an interesting question of whether this sort of difference in empowerment actually impacts what adaptation or strategies a woman might take and whether she feels capable of actually doing so. So just to conclude, wanted to wrap this up together with some implications of what these initial results show. For me, at least, it's pretty clear that we need differentiated strategies within sort of the broad category of women. We already know that there are different needs between men and women, but there are also different needs within or amongst women within communities. Information, obviously, is a really important channel by which to improve adaptive capacity and give information about what things can be done to adapt practices. So it's important to recognize that there are different channels by which this information can be conveyed. Ghana already has tried to put in place more female extension officers, although that hasn't played out as much on the ground, and so that would be an area to strengthen for the country. And finally, there was emphasis on the need for more support and access to credit, as well as a recognition that sort of community groups would be helpful in this. And so this opportunity to facilitate those would help enable some income diversification, as well as probably empower those who are feeling a little bit helpless. And on that, I will end.